Hello, I'm Jeff Paur, senior writer with RealTime Fantasy Sports. Welcome to the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. And on today's show, I'm going to give you my starts, sits, and sleepers for week one of the fantasy football season. Yes, week one is here. I'm going to do this video every week. I'm going to give you 3 starts, 3 sits, and a sleeper from the QB, running back, and receiver position. And then I'm going to give you 2 starts, 2 sits, and a sleeper at tight end, since that position isn't quite as deep. So I'm going to do this every week of the fantasy football season. Good luck to you in all your leagues this year. I hope you have a lot of success. Still time to get in some leagues here at RealTime Fantasy Sports. So if you want to do that, go to RTSports.com, click on that money league link, and see everything we have to offer. But for these start sits and sleepers, I'm going to kind of go rapid fire here so I can give you as many names as possible and don't make the video too long. So I won't go crazy in depth on my reasoning, but I will definitely give you reasonings for them. So I will start right now with the QB position. Here are 3 starts for you at the quarterback spot. My first one is Trevor Lawrence. Carolina was dreadful against the pass last year. They allowed the 5th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I think Lawrence is going to get plenty of chances to air it out. Liam Cohen is going to get this guy going this year. I think Lawrence starts fast in week one. My next start at QB is Drake May. He opens against the Raiders. New offense, lots of weapons in New England now. Josh McDaniels is there as well. I think Drake May starts fast against the Raiders. Not the best secondary in the world. I think he'll have success in week one. My last start at QB is Kyler Murray. Lowly Saints to open the season for Murray. They might be the worst team in football. I think this game's going to be a blowout. Cardinals are going to put up a lot of points. I try to get as many Cardinals involved in week one. Here are 3 sits at QB now. My first one's Caleb Williams. So Minnesota had one of the better defenses in football last year, especially against the pass. They allowed the 7th fewest fantasy points to QBs last year. And Williams had fewer than 13 fantasy points his last game against Minnesota. I do think Williams is going to get it going this year. I think he's going to have a good season, take a step forward in year 2, but I don't like him this first week of the season. I might steer clear of him. My next sit at QB, CJ Stroud. Still offensive line issues in my view. I still think they have some concern there. Rams defense should be improved against the pass as well. So I'm kind of doing a wait and see with Stroud. I'm just not going to use him until I see him start doing it on the field again, especially if you have him. You likely took him as a backup. So I'm going to let him play a few games before I trust him in my starting lineup. My last sit at QB is Matthew Stafford. Coming off a back injury, he's done little all preseason training camp. Texans have a really strong defense as well. I just don't want any part of Stafford in this matchup. Again, a guy that hasn't done much, back injury, not good. My sleeper at QB is Michael Penix. Finished last year really on a high note, showed his potential that last week of the season, 29.1 fantasy points in week 18, starts from day one this year, gets the Bucs in what should be a high-scoring game in my opinion. Tampa Bay really good against the run, but they struggled against the pass last year. They allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to quarterbacks. I think Penix is a good streaming play this week. All right, let's get into the running back position. I'll give you 3 starts, 3 sits, and a sleeper at the running back spot. We'll start with my starts. My first one's Kenneth Walker. I think the Seattle running game is going to be really strong this year. Walker found the end zone in each of his games against the 49ers last year. That's who they play this week. And San Francisco allowed the 4th most fantasy points to running backs. Walker's going to be a great play in this one. My next one's Chuba Hubbard. Jaguars, team that really struggled against the run last year. That's who Chuba Hubbard plays this week. They allowed 132.6 rushing yards per game. Hubbard is going to be the workhorse back in this offense. I think this is a great, tasty matchup in week one for Hubbard. I think he runs wild against the Jags. My last start is Austin Eckler. So I kind of feel like he's the forgotten man on the depth chart in Washington, but he's listed number 1 right now. He gets the Giants. They allowed the 6th most fantasy points to running backs last year. Eckler had double-digit fantasy points in each of his 2 games against the Giants last season. I think he does well again in this matchup. I think he's a good play as a low-end number 2 or flex option for fantasy teams. All right, here are my 3 sits at running back. My first one's James Cook. Could start a little slow in my opinion. Held out, missed a lot of camp preseason action, and he has a tough matchup against the Ravens rush defense. In 2 games against the Ravens last year, Cook had 26 carries for just 106 yards and didn't score a touchdown. So I'm not sure the Bills are going to have huge success running the ball in this game. I think Cooks might be a guy I might fade in week 1. My next sit is Javonte Williams. Scary playing week 1 against the Eagles. I'm just still not sure how this Cowboys rush game is going to play out. They have three backs that could get work, and he gets the Eagles very good against the run. They allowed the fewest fantasy points for running backs last year. I just think it's a scary option using Williams this week. If you have better ones, I would go with them. And my last guy is in the same boat as Williams, in my opinion. That's Isaiah Pacheco. I think they're going to use three backs in Kansas City this year, so that's going to make Pacheco a little bit of a scary weekly option. I want to know how they're going to use him in this rotation before I start plugging and playing him. And he plays the Chargers this week. That's a pretty solid secondary over there in Los Angeles, so I'm a little bit worried about him in this matchup. Again, another guy I want to kind of wait and see before I start using him. All right, my sleeper running back is Jordan Mason. I think the Vikings are really going to be run heavy this week against the Bears. J.J. McCarthy's making his first NFL start. Bears have been very good against the pass, but not so good against the run in recent memory. They actually allowed the third most fantasy points of running backs last year. I look for Mason to get a heavy workload. He's going to be the 1B. They say it's a 1A, 1B situation where they're both listed as starters in Minnesota. I think Mason gets off to a fast start, gets a lot of work, and shows well in week one. All right, here's three of my starts, sits, and then a sleeper receiver. We'll start with the starts as always. First one's Drake London, averaged 23 points, fantasy points per game with Michael Penix as his starter last year. He gets them from day one this year, and he gets a bad Tampa secondary. They're good against the run, as I mentioned, but not good against the pass. London had 16 catches for 188 yards and a touchdown against the Bucs last year. I think he starts in a big way this season. My next play for this week, my next start is another guy involved in that game, and it's Emeka Egbuka. With Chris Godwin out, Ibuka is going to play a big role in this offense, getting all sorts of hype. Jalen McMillan's out as well. I think Ibuka starts in a hurry his rookie season in these first few weeks, and he gets a Falcons secondary, not very good against the pass. They allowed the second most fantasy points to receivers last season. I think Ibuka is going to get a lot of targets. He looked fantastic in the preseason, and I'm expecting big things from him in week one. My last start at receivers, Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. Tyreek Hill, he hasn't practiced much at all this training camp, done very little, and Waddle could be forming a better rapport with Tua Tagovailoa this year. I think he could be more heavily involved in the offense. Good matchup against the Colts. They allowed the 12th most fantasy points receivers last year. I think Waddle's going to be more involved in the offense, and it starts this week. I look for him to have a strong week one. All right, my sits at receiver. My first one's Zay Flowers. So he's a pretty marquee receiver, but he gets the Bills this week. They held him to just a catch for 10 yards last year. Zay Flowers can be a little up and down in this offense. I think they could be really run heavy in this game, an area that Buffalo really struggled against last year. So I think Flowers could be so-so. He'll probably do better than the one catch for 10 yards he had against the Bills last year, but I still don't think he's going to be a great play. My next sit is Adam Thielen. So he heads back to Minnesota. He's going to get a chance to start with Jordan Addison out, but he's not just a plug-and-play guy. He's a matchup play, and a matchup against Chicago is not a good one for him. They allowed the fewest fantasy points for receivers last year. I just don't think I would use him just yet. If you're going to use him in a better matchup. And my last sit is a guy in the exact same situation. In my opinion, it's Isaac Tesla. So he got all sorts of buzz, won the number 3 receiver job in Detroit. But again, this is not a guy you're just going to throw in your lineup. He's a matchup play, and he gets the Packers this week. Team that allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points for receivers last year. I would avoid Tesla in this one. All right, here's my sleeper receiver, and it's Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns. He's really a boomer bust play. He can go off any week. He can also disappear one week. But I think this is a week you might want to take a chance on him. He gets some Bengals in what could be a high-scoring game where the Browns are playing from behind. Joe Flacco's playing quarterback. We know he likes to air it out. I think Tillman could get some chances to stretch a field in this one. So he's a good dart throw, in my opinion, in week one. All right, here's my tight end starts, sits, and sleepers. I'm going to give you 2 starts, 2 sits, and a sleeper at tight end. My first start's Travis Kelce. It's early in the season. He's healthy. He's fresh. He's newly engaged. He's playing on prime time. I think he's going to want to make a statement in week one. Plays the Chargers. He had 12 catches against the Chargers in 2 games last year. Rashee Rice is out. They're kind of banged up at receiver as well. I think Kelce could get a lot of targets in this one. My other start at tight ends, David Njoku. Browns, they allowed the Bengals allowed the most fantasy points to tight ends last year. 18 receptions on 24 targets in 2 games against the Bengals last year for Njoku. I think he could be heavily involved in this matchup for Cleveland, and I think Njoku starts off fast. All right, here's 2 sits for you at tight end. My first one's Tucker Kraft. He gets the Lions. They allowed the second fewest fantasy points to tight ends last year. I do think Kraft is going to have a pretty solid season, but last year he showed he could be a little up and down. He has a lot to compete with for targets in this offense as well. So I think he might get off to a bit of a slow start in this one against a good Lions secondary. My other sit's Juwan Johnson, another guy. It's kind of a matchup play. I think he does have some potential, but I'm just still worried about that quarterback situation. Spencer Rattler is going to open the season as a starter. Don't totally trust him. He gets a Cardinals. This is an improved defense in Arizona. They allowed the fewest fantasy points to tight ends as well, so Johnson could start slow in week 1. All right, here's my sleeper now at tight end. It's Hunter Henry, another New England Patriot I have on the list. New offense really likes the tight end. Josh McDaniels has a history of favoring the tight end, and I think Henry's going to get a lot of looks in this new Patriots offense. He gets the Raiders in week 1. They're so overall, and they allowed the 4th most fantasy points to tight ends last season. All right, those are my starts, sits, and sleepers for week 1 of the fantasy season. It was a lot to get through, but we made it. And you're going to make it this week as well. Good luck to all of you in all of your games this week. I hope you have a lot of success. This has been Jeff Paur for Real Time Fantasy Sports.